Morning, class. This is our seventh session together, seventh lecture. And today we're going to deal with antitrust and monopolies, chapter 27. And before I do that, let me first get into, go back over the assignments and some of the changes we made. I want to also, I'm going to look here at my volume just to make sure I've got it up for you. Hopefully it's going to work okay for everybody today. We're going to be, it's busy couple of weeks for you all, I know, and so I feel like I'm trying to make it reduce the workload a little bit. I don't know how successful I'm being, but certainly my intent. In that respect, we have our discussion boards and our reflection assignments, which are due on Sunday, but because the research paper is due on Sunday, if you need to go through till Monday afternoon or Monday evening to get the research and discussion board things done, that's fine with me if you haven't already done them. That'll give you a little leeway there, because I'm suspecting that most of you are probably going to be working at these reflection papers, possibly over the weekend. I think I might have mentioned it once before. I know when I did my thesis, they tried to get us started about into the fourth or fifth month of our 2-year course, and like a lot of us do with all the other things we have going on, I finally got it down to, even though I gathered all the research, I finally got down to actually trying to write it about 3 or 4 months before the end of the course, 2-year course, and it sure took a lot of time trying to get it done at the last minute, but I think that's something we all face. So in any event, for discussion board and learning reflection paper, if you need until the end of Monday night to get them in, we can work with that, so don't be concerned with that. Also, to reiterate, you're not doing anything or reading chapter 26 on land use control, and you're just going to have read antitrust and monopoly. It's going to be the subject of my lecture today. I realize I'm doing a lot of uhs, so I guess I'm going to have to learn to get to be a better public speaker in this regard. I don't see anything else here except to mention to you that I will get, there's kind of somewhat of a study guide on this amendment to the syllabus I sent out recently, and the focus is going to will be on employment discrimination law, which is chapter 22, less so on chapter 24 and chapter 25, which are consumer protection and environmental law. So you just need to know what several of the laws are there and what they mean. I would simply, if you're doing a study outline, I would just simply put down each law and maybe write a sentence or two or a couple bullet points of what they deal with. I wouldn't go into great detail with those two. So the ones to be really sharp on is on the agency section, has to do with the respondent superior, the employer's responsibilities for the actions of his agent, who is his employee. And also at-will contracts are important. And then finally, on employment relations, that one, again, just understanding some of the statutes there relative to, for example, Americans with Disabilities Act, age discrimination, those sorts of things, equal pay. Those are important areas from a management perspective. Those are issues that would pop up in your roles as managers that you need to be aware of, acutely aware of. And then we'll talk about the discrimination section, chapter, and that'll also be that'll be pretty significant in the short quiz I give. So that's the study guide in a nutshell. And so I realize you've got some things to do here. We're going to do the corporate scandals paper. That'll come in by March 3rd. I'm looking for that. And in the reflection paper, I'd like you to just really think of yourself as a judge when you write that one up, and indicate on that case your opinion and why, and referencing specific chapter sections or pages in the chapter that support your decision as the judge. And if you want to go outside of that, that's fine. There are some people that went outside last week on the last discussion board, and I thought that was sensational. I was really, really excited about that. That some of you took the initiative to get out there and dig into the outcome of that case. That was the case was that? Oh, that was the Cumbie case, and also the sexual harassment case. So anyway, good job on those by those who got out and did a little extra research. I was impressed with that. Okay, so let me move forward now into antitrust and monopolies. The whole idea of, I'm not sure this will be a major shorter term legal issue for management, because I'm not sure how many of you work for public companies. You may or may not. This primarily goes towards public companies, but it does give you a little background on business as a whole. And so from a regulatory standpoint, the government does attempt in its own way to try to level the playing field, or give people with businesses and new business ideas a fair start or shot at getting some market share and building their business. So certainly private companies can benefit from some of these laws that are in place. So let me talk about the environment of business. The way that the chapter starts off, it indicates that the environment of business is one of competition. You try to come up with a product or a service that is better than anybody else's, that is more appealing to anybody else's or any of your competitors, and that delivers a service or a product at the best possible price. And you put all that together and hopefully you have a profit. And then of course, if you don't have a profit, you're not going to be around very long. So the idea of business, the concept that we have in this country is that everybody in an industry can be competing, but we try to keep that on a level playing field so that everyone has a chance to make their mark in their industry and can't be squeezed out or run over by a large competitor or a large rival who has a substantial market share and is just going to crush anybody that tries to come in. The ultimate goal, part of the idea philosophically, which I think makes a lot of sense, is that what makes business grow and be dynamic is people coming along and innovating with new products and services, creating new markets, or creating a rival product to one that may have been around for a long time that's just a better product because someone was innovative. And the way that has to be done, you have to be protected. If you're the one trying to come out with a new innovative product, you have to be protected from others who are well established who might just plain run over you because of their market share, their financial resources, their reputation, branding, what have you. And so the purpose of the antitrust laws in the country, and many of the states have adopted very similar laws, is to prevent or correct conduct that interferes with free enterprise, that interferes with free and open competition. So the whole idea of the antitrust laws is to protect, prevent, and correct any anti-competitive behavior that just is basically unfair to others in the marketplace. There are two categories that come about with respect to antitrust activity. One is where someone is engaged in conduct where they're endeavoring to establish a monopoly power in the marketplace. Now, in certain settings, we will allow what would be deemed a monopoly, and I'll go into that in a minute, but the whole idea is to not allow someone to totally monopolize a market, because once they do, then the benefits to the consumer are affected, because now without any competitors they can price their product or service at whatever they want, and that does away with the competition in business. The other one is conduct that is an unreasonable restraint of trade. So there are two different concepts. One, you can have minuscule conduct or activities that restrain trade, and in the other category, you've got conduct that is gauged merely or simply for you to obtain monopoly power in your industry or market. Um, Market power is just that. It's the ability to control your market. And one of the interesting ones, which I didn't look at it from this perspective before, was that the text points out that we actually give legalized monopolies, and that is in the area of copyrights and patents. And so intellectual property has its own protections, if you will, protecting of monopolies, so to speak, for a certain specific time. Now, the one probably most notable to most people is in the drug business, or in any business where you get a patent, but the drug business is probably a great example for a couple of reasons. One is drug companies, what's the justification? Well, the justification is that drug companies, the time frame from the initial research into a drug to its going on the marketplace can run anywhere from 5 to 10 to 12 years or more. So, and during that time, the company is spending large sums of money in the R&D side of their business to come up with a drug that deals with some disease or health problem that it helps correct. And so the concept is that in that case, once they've spent all that money, they're entitled to a monopoly for a period of time in order to recoup that investment. Otherwise, what would be their encouragement to be innovative if they don't get any protection? Because it's very easy in today's world, and has been for a number of years, to what we call reverse engineer a product, or and come out with a similar product and maybe even a better product, but you didn't have to go through all the stages of getting the right combination to come up with the original product. So that's the concept that's behind the patent law, is to give a legalized monopoly to someone like a drug company so that they can sell their drug for the next 20 years and make a lot of money, recouping their investment and plus, and keep competitors out. You may already know that in the drug business, in the pharmacy business, or pharmaceutical business, once a patent goes off, literally, and in fact, a year or two before it goes off, generic drug makers will start researching and or reverse engineering the drug if they haven't already done it, knowing that it's coming off patent in a year or so, and they'll begin to use their marketing distribution systems and whatnot to get out there and start to promote their generic drug. The other thing too is that the pharmaceutical companies will then have to probably make price adjustments because they've been selling a drug that for $100 for a 30-day supply, and now the generic people are going to come out and sell it for $25 or $30 for a month's supply, and now the drug company has to lower its price in all probability. Although there are some situations where a drug company's brand is so strong that people will pay the extra money for the branded drug, but still in all, now they are subject to competition from other people in the industry, and their monopoly, if you will, their legalized monopoly, is ended. The goal of antitrust law, as it relates to market power, and that is where you are, because that's the striving of business, is to establish a predominant product, be the first mover in your industry with a product that you, of course, that's your motivation, your incentive is to monopolize or get as much of the market share as you can. But the goal of antitrust is regulating a couple things. One, how you go about getting that dominant market share, or getting that larger market share. How do you go about doing that? Are there anti-competitive behavior or conduct on your part? And then the conduct you engage in once you get it. So in other words, then are you in a position where you're now trying to do whatever it takes to keep competitors from coming in? And is that on a level playing field, or are you engaged in some kind of anti-competitive behavior? What might be an example would be, in fact, I have a personal example of that from a little private company I invested in some years ago that was in the lighting business, and we were the company was making various types of residential lighting and whatnot, and then we got into another product which was lighting for parking lots. And literally what happened was is that a number of the large competitors went to our buyers, went to the customers in our industry and said, if you buy from these people, we won't sell you the other stuff. So we won't sell you our other products and so forth. And these were larger branded people. And did we have an antitrust suit? Probably. Did we have the money to pursue it? No. And would the government have seen that as something large enough to take on themselves? It's doubtful. Who would know? But that's one of the concepts where people have large market shares, even if it's only 10 or 12 or 15%, that may be a large enough share because they've got a whole network of customers. And so if they go to a customer and say, well, McQuitty's company's coming out with this parking lot product that's we don't like it, they're going to tell you it's inferior one thing or another, and it may not be. It may be better, and it may be cheaper. But they're certainly in a position then to say, if you want our other products, then don't buy from them. You'll never find anything in writing in that respect, but in fact, it does happen. And it happens with some frequency. But it takes a kind of conduct that is large enough in a given industry that the government would get interested in doing something about it. Now, with respect to antitrust, there was really very little interest, or you might even say need, for antitrust back in the 1850s, 60s, and the 1880s, because business was very much mom and pop, small. We didn't get into the real industrialization of the country until around the 1880s. And when that began to occur, then you got situations where people who were first movers in a given industry or marketplace could literally squeeze everybody else out. And prior to that, there were common law rules against restraint of trade. There was a recognized legal theory under common law that people couldn't restrain trade. The problem was that it took a private company to go after the person who was engaged in that conduct. And a lot of times private companies didn't have the money. They were kind of like our little lighting company. We didn't have the money, or we just tried to figure out to go some other way because we hit a stone wall there. Well, along about the 1880s, it became apparent to our government that if we were going to have a vibrant economy and we were going to have a free capitalistic marketplace, then we needed to do some things. The government needed to do some things to try to prevent this monopolization and to try to break up companies that were too big in controlling the market, because then, of course, they're controlling prices, and people are going to be forced to pay through the nose, if you will, for a product that really there should be some other options out there for you. So we look back at the origins of federal antitrust legislation, which is Section 2. I mentioned that the private parties generally were the ones who tried to enforce what would then have been the forerunner of antitrust law using common law, but it was not very effective. And there are a couple of things the book talks about. One is the Western movement of the population of the country after the Civil War. As it began to increase and increase more and more, then you had the origin of the railroads and the large railroads. And they tended to be controlled by a small group of businessmen, and they could have a tremendous say in the pricing of transportation, shipment of goods, and so forth. But probably the most famous one is John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil. You may know this, and I may have mentioned it once before, but oil was first discovered, believe it or not, in Pennsylvania, in the United States. That's where oil was discovered, not Texas, not some of the other. I guess Texas tends to be the most famous, and Louisiana oil areas, but it was Pennsylvania. And John D. Rockefeller was one of the first people involved in the oil industry in Pennsylvania. And there was a lot of individual little small companies that were drilling wherever they could get the rights to do so. And Rockefeller was a very, very clever, persistent, driven businessman. And he saw the potential for the oil. At first, the oil was being used to make kerosene, which was the material that was used to light homes and everything before electricity. So there was an enormous demand for kerosene. And at one point, Pennsylvania was supplying the majority of oil used almost in the entire world, certainly in the United States. And Rockefeller got the idea to avoid the common law relative to restraint of trade. He came up with the idea of trusts. And the Standard Oil Company was actually a trust company, Standard Oil Trust. And what he did was he went around to all of the individual producers of oil, all the little companies, got them to join Standard Oil. They would exchange their stock certificate ownerships of their company for certificates of trust from Standard Oil. And now Rockefeller basically had built complete control of the marketplace. And they could set prices any way they want. They could ship when they wanted to ship, to whom. So they had tremendous leverage on the consumer and to the distributor who would be buying the oil from them. The government finally looked at this and said something has to be done, because Rockefeller, you just think about him as being controlling the oil industry. Well, he controlled more than that. Well, he quickly saw that the keys to what we call an integrated monopoly is for him to own railroads and to own tank cars. And at one point he owned almost all the tank cars used in the United States to ship the oil. So now he could decide what railroad he wanted to ship them on to get the best price from them. And then eventually he actually bought sections of railroad and whatnot, where now he had the ability to control the product coming out of the ground, how much and where it was going to go. And then he had the monopoly over how it was going to get transported, and he had a monopoly over how it was going to get there, because he could use his alternative methods of shipping at a lower price. So he forced the railroads that he didn't control to lower their prices to make sure that he got the profit margins he was looking for. So he was without a doubt one of the great industrialists of our age, of that age. And finally, the federal government in 1914 went after him. Teddy Roosevelt was the president, known as the Trust Buster, and he revved up public opinion, went to Congress, and they passed the Sherman Antitrust Law, which they passed the Clayton Act in 1914, which identifies specific actions which they were easily able to pick up from following what Rockefeller had done. So let's talk about the first federal legislation in antitrust. It actually went back to 1890, which was the Sherman Act I just mentioned a moment ago. So you have the Sherman Act of 1890 and you have the Clayton Act of 1914. The Sherman Act, 1890, was the first attempt by the government to deal with anti-competitive behavior, but it was very broad. It didn't really specify exactly what was anti-competitive behavior. It prohibited competitors from making agreements that created unreasonable restraints of trade. Now, as I've said before, anytime we as a people or a society think that someone's conduct is so offensive or has such wide-ranging detrimental impacts on us, we'll not only make it a civil offense, we'll make it a criminal offense. And at this time, Congress felt under the Sherman Act that it needed the teeth of criminal penalties as well as civil. So the Sherman Act provides for civil and criminal penalties for those who violate this definition, which is where you enter into an agreement that prohibits competitors from making agreements that create unreasonable restraints of trade. Now the problem with this, as it turned out, is that the Supreme Court narrowly construed that law. This was a major change in our view of economics and our view of capitalism in the country. Excuse me, I think it's sip. So it was new. And the Supreme Court's decisions very often will reflect what it sees as the consensus of the public. They'll do that even though they do follow the law. They look at the black letter law and try to come to a reasonable interpretation of that law. But if it's kind of a brand new concept, they're not as quick to broaden the law, find that it reaches further out. And that being the case, the Sherman Act turned out to be a little too narrow to do what the government had hoped to do. and that's when the Clayton Act came along in 1914, and it listed specific conduct that it deemed to be anti-competitive. And the text gives you four of those. One is price discrimination. Another one is called exclusionary practices, which is getting together and cutting other people out. Corporate mergers. I looked at the Clayton Act as corporate mergers. And lastly, it deals with what we know as called interlocking directorates, which I'll go into in a minute, and which are pretty much non-existent in today's business world. Okay, now price discrimination. This is where someone charges a different price to competing buyers for identical goods. So you're favoring one buyer over another, and you're giving them a competitive advantage, which in effect restrains trade because the consumer can't go to 2 or 3 different sellers of this product. It has to go to there's only one that has that product, and therefore that's going to be a restraint of trade because it's going to be anti-competitive in terms of pricing. So that's price discrimination. The exception, so to speak, is that if the seller could show that by having a different pricing structure for different sellers, different buyers rather, they could show that there was a cost benefit, or they could show that production costs were reduced, transportation costs were reduced, whatever they might be, that showed that it was justifiable difference, then it wouldn't be deemed a violation of the Clayton Act. It wouldn't be deemed as price discrimination. For this statute to apply, you had to be engaged in interstate commerce. And the language that the court uses is 3 words: substantially lessens competition. And of course the word that is open to interpretation is substantially. What's substantially? So if it was found that the conduct substantially lessened competition, it was a violation of the Clayton Act. Your defenses were, as I might have mentioned, the seller is saving costs for the seller. Another one is you're meeting the price of the competition. So you can engage in some of this price differentiation if you're trying to fight the competition for market share. And then lastly, if there's a change in the marketplace itself that you don't control, that outside forces have changed the marketplace, and now you need to reestablish yourself, so you go out and maybe offer price differences for different customers. But it's all in response to a market that's moving in a way that you need to do something to maintain your position in it. The second one is exclusionary practices, and it calls exclusionary dealing contracts, where the seller forbids the buyer of his goods from purchasing the products from a competitor. So it's somewhat in a way of what we're talking about with our little lighting company, in that a seller of products would forbid the buyers who would buy both our product and theirs from buying from us because we were competitors and they weren't going to provide other products to them. A tying arrangement is probably another one. Also, as it's part of the exclusionary practices, and probably more akin to what I was talking about with our lighting company, where it says it's a condition of being able to purchase one of the seller's products requiring you buy another. In other words, in order to purchase a product, you have to buy the other product. So in this case, the bigger lighting company might say, unless you if you want to buy our residential lighting products or packages for your homes you're building, then you've got to buy your lighting equipment, for the parking lot lighting equipment and so forth, from us. The third one is corporate mergers, and this has to do with corporations. This is a major area in today's world, has been throughout, where 2 corporations want to merge, and the effect is going to be a restraint of trade, or going to lessen the competitive environment. And the Department of Justice is the one who approves mergers between corporations. So it basically says that if one corporation is a significant holder of stock or assets of another business in the same industry, and the merger will cause a substantial lessening of competition, then the Department of Justice will not approve the merger. And they have done that in a number of cases. Microsoft at one point tried to buy an accounting software company, I believe, called Intuit. And Intuit had a predominant market share in the accounting software area, and the Justice Department decided that that was going to be anti-competitive, and so they they refused to approve that merger. Another thing, kind of a political side note to the Department of Justice mergers and corporate mergers, is it can also depend on which political party is in place, in power. If the Republicans are in power, they tend to be more pro-business, and they're more likely to probably let a merger take place. You might say, well, what's that all about? It's probably gonna lessen competition when two big companies come together to offer products in the same industry. The Democrats, on the other hand, see it the other way, and they tend to be more objecting to mergers of corporations in the same industry. And so the Obama administration, for example, has been a little more difficult to get by when you come to corporate mergers. Now, finally, the last one is interlocking directorates. And this is where you have directors of two companies in the same business, in the same industry. So you've got directors in Company A and Company B, and they both sell the same product in the same market. And the court and the Congress has determined that that is very anti-competitive, as you can easily see. And the Federal Trade Commission is the one that oversees that and looks into that. And you'll notice the text tells you, and these numbers are lower than I thought they would be, but they are. They set the thresholds for interlocking directorates. So they're the ones who decide at what level companies are large enough that they can't have interlocking directorates. They can't have two companies in the same industry with directors on both boards. One is if a company has assets or capital or surplus exceeding $25 million, which is not real big. I would have thought this would have been somewhere in the range of $100 million, because a $25 million company, in my mind, can't really be a huge market power. But this is what the Federal Trade Commission said. The alternative is if you have sales in excess of about $2.5 million, which again is not a large sum in today's world for a lot of small companies. A lot of small companies do $2.5, $3 million in sale. In fact, my little heating and air conditioning company that sells heating and air conditioning equipment, their sales are almost $4 million. They don't have any kind of market share where I could see them interlocking a board of directors with some other company and making a smashing competition. But in any event, that's what the FTC, they set it out. They set the threshold every year, and in 2010 that was the threshold. If it's higher, it couldn't be more than about 30 million, if that. Okay, so the Federal Trade Commission Act was passed. I'm not sure I have the date on that. Let me see if I can find that. The Federal Trade Commission Act was, and it's not in my notes because it doesn't say it, but it must be up here somewhere. In any event, it came after the Clayton Act of 1914. And what it did, excuse me, under Section 5, is it created a catch-all for what could be deemed anti-competitive behavior. So it basically said that all forms of anti-competitive behavior not covered by the Sherman or Clayton Act may still be declared anti-competitive and in violation of the Fair Trade Acts and so forth that we have. So it can be prohibited under the Federal Trade Commission Act. Enforcement, as I said, is done by the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission. The Sherman Act is only enforced by the Department of Justice. That is primarily because it has criminal penalties in it. And the Department of Justice obviously is a criminal enforcing agency, whereas the FTC and the Department of Justice can enforce the Clayton Act. And the Clayton Act, as you know, has a number of areas that the Department of Justice is very strong in. Price discrimination, and also in mergers, corporate mergers. They play a big role. Now, under both the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission, they have a couple of interesting powers here in enforcement. One is they can ask the court to direct a company to divest itself of a division or a portion of its operations. And at one time, there was, in the Microsoft antitrust case, which was a huge case, there was an effort by the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission to force Microsoft to break itself up into several different divisions, because the Windows platform was one area, and then all the applications that went on top of that, if I recall, were all synced with Microsoft Windows, and they wouldn't work. You couldn't work those applications in any other operating system platform. And so that was one of the attacks that the DOJ took in that huge Microsoft antitrust case, and it never went that far, because that would have crippled Microsoft if that had been pulled off by the enforcement agencies. The other thing that the DOJ and the Federal Trade Commission can do is ask for injunctive relief, which is the quickest way to stop somebody from engaging in anti-competitive behavior, is you go get the court to issue an injunction. They are not easy to get, but they can be obtained, and they do get obtained by large companies against another company for anti-competitive behavior. Excuse me. Now, private lawsuits are permitted. The Supreme Court has narrowed down or limited the number of these antitrust private party lawsuits. When I say private party, as opposed to the government, they're usually brought by other corporations. And part of the reason I think that the Supreme Court decided to limit it is it was being used as a business strategy, not just because the competing companies said, "Oh my God, they're stealing their behavior is necessarily anti-competitive." They're saying their behavior is anti-competitive as to us, and that needs to be stopped. And it might or might not be, but they would try very hard to embroil the other company in a lawsuit to either try to get some kind of a settlement out of it, or and agree to what the other company would do, or maybe even get an injunction against their competitors. So the courts have narrowed that down. Now, the big reason that the private companies started using the antitrust laws, the Clayton Act primarily, is because it provided for what we lawyers like to call treble damages. Why we don't call it triple damages, I don't know, but treble damages probably sounds more impressive, and who knows, maybe lawyers charge more money to say that. But in any event, it's 3 times the actual damages, and that's what prompts some private entities, meaning companies in the private sector, be they public or whatever, to go after their competitors, is because they think they have a shot at getting 3 times the actual damages they suffered. Now, they're going to be able to, they wouldn't get engaged in this unless they could specifically show the acts and what the actual damages were, which would probably be measured by a loss in revenue in a given product, or a loss of customer base, or that sort of thing. But if they can show it, and if in fact the court decides that the conduct is anti-competitive, it's a nice payday for the other company. Okay, now there are exemptions to the antitrust laws. Remember, in terms of antitrust laws deal with restraint of trade. They primarily focus on the restraint of trade, and that can be someone who's got a monopoly who's trying to crush even anyone else from coming in, or it can involve someone who just is engaged in any kind of conduct that restrains the opportunities for other companies to innovate, bring in a new product and whatnot. Now, the exemptions are, the book gives you 3 of them: labor unions, insurance companies, and foreign trade. They are not subject to antitrust law. Give you an example of the labor. If the labor unions were subject to antitrust laws, then you could make the argument that their striking and so forth is anti-competitive. They pick, as you know, the auto workers generally for years, what their strategy was is they would pick one of the big 3. They'd pick either GM, Ford, or Chrysler and go to that plant and negotiate hard, and if they didn't get what they wanted, they'd strike that company. They wouldn't strike the other 2. So now the other 2 are going along. The idea is to, if you don't cave in, we're going to drive you out of business. So it's a restraint of trade in that respect. Well, the antitrust laws exempt them, so they can do that, and they do it. And what it does then is it kind of sets the tone for the other two companies negotiating union contracts as they expire and need to be renegotiated. Okay, now the U.S. antitrust laws, I'm wondering if I skipped a page here. I hope not, but I might have. No, good. Okay, we're going to be out of here quick. So I use that term a lot. I was telling my wife the other night that I keep telling you all that I'm going to be quick, and I'm not quick, as you know. Long-winded. I think it comes with the profession, maybe. But in any event, antitrust laws and global trade, the important thing to know here is antitrust laws have a broad application, so they apply into foreign commerce. So any U.S. company that is doing things that are anti-competitive to foreign customers, maybe to foreign companies, are subject to the United States, the federal government coming after them for that. And the reason is that you have global trading. And so if we allow our if we don't show the rest of the world that we're going to try to clamp down on a U.S. company that's a dominant company in a product maybe in the world, and other countries are bringing on innovative ideas relative to that product, and those companies are getting squished out or run over by our companies, the federal government says, you know, that's bad for our relationship with these other countries and their economies and our trade, and so we're going to go after them. So the Department of Justice will go after a U.S. company that is committing anti-competitive behavior in another country. And they'll do it on behalf of foreign consumers. They'll do it on behalf of foreign competitors. And they use the Sherman Act because it's extraterritorial. It allows them, it covers the conspiracy wherever that substantially affects U.S. commerce. So again, the Sherman Act is extraterritorial. It impacts or covers any conspiracy wherever that substantially affects U.S. commerce. So you can see where it's applied broadly across the board. Foreign antitrust laws, what you're fighting today is that many countries, as they become more industrialized, more developed, are writing and issuing their own antitrust laws that then equally will apply to U.S. companies coming in there. And the whole concept is that we're going to try to prevent trade wars and keep the economic trade on a balanced, on a level playing field. Probably the most powerful force outside of the United States that has antitrust laws that they enforce quite vigorously is the European Common Market. And if you know anything about the European Common Market, it was a long time in coming. Time flies. It may be 15 or 20 years old. I don't think it's more than 25 years old, but that's fairly recent in terms of business and whatnot. And what it amounted to was, with the globalization of the economy in the 1980s, so I guess it could be 25 years older, what was happening is the United States was so powerful and so strong that the individual countries in Europe, Germany, France, Spain, England, well, actually it was the continental Europe to start with, and then eventually they let other countries come in. But the idea was that by them joining together in what they called the European Union, the EU, that they could then counter the strength of the U.S. economy and U.S. business and compete with them on a price and production basis. And part of the biggest stumbling block was the currency, because they wanted to use a single currency and not use the various national currencies, because, as you know, the value of one country's currency can rise and fall against other countries, and this can create problems for trade, because if your money's worth less in another country than theirs is, then you know your product you're going to have to spend more on your product to match the cost of the other country's currency. So in any event, the European Common Market did come together, and they began passing their own antitrust laws. Their list of specific actions is broader than in the United States, which in some respects reflects, to me, as you've been reading or know, the Western European countries over the years have become more and more socialistic. And once you start putting socialistic ideas or concepts into an economy, it has the impact of taking the free market down, restricting it more, and therefore confining business to a certain extent. And that's the gripe about socialism. And that's what the European Common Market has, the European Union and the Common Market's been viewed as, is it's overly restrictive. And as you know, in the current financial crises we have, one of the problems the European Union has is there are some countries who are, Germany for example, is relatively strong economically and financially, and because they're in the Union, they're being called upon to prop up other governments. And the problem that you have with the European Common Market as opposed to the United States is we have 50 states that have joined in a union, and after the Civil War it's become pretty apparent you don't leave the United States. You're part of the country and you can't go anywhere. And our nationalistic fabric is woven among all the 50 states. We're all Americans. You don't have that in Europe. You've got Germans, you've got French, you've got Spanish, or Spaniards, or and you've got different nationalities, and nationalism is nationalism. It's kind of the old story, blood's thicker than water. Family is thicker than friends, and it's likewise that way in nationalism as it relates to the European Union and the economics of the European Union. The nationalistic views of each country transcend the European Union. And so Germany has started saying, well, why should we, we ran our house properly. Maybe we didn't get as socialistic as a lot of these countries did. France is extremely socialistic. So is Spain. And so maybe, the Germans' attitude is, wait a minute, we saved our money. We didn't give it away to workers. We didn't make it impossible to fire people who don't work like you did in Spain and you did in France. And it's your tough luck. Greece, of course, is the big one. And that's where you hear the complaints about the U.S. economy and where this administration seems to be taking the country, which seemingly seems to be more of a socialistic view of a lot of things, and so you have objections to that kind of thing. Depends on what you believe in. If you believe the better way of life is created by a capitalistic system, I mean, I'm not going to preach that the capitalistic system doesn't need to be regulated. It certainly does, as you'll see from the Sarbanes-Oxley laws that attack the scandals that went on. I mean, human nature is human nature, and if people get the power to be greedy, they're going to, which is why we have the antitrust laws. But the fact remains that you can see from looking at Greece and other European countries who've gone much further socialistically than we have, that the quality of life has dropped, deteriorated, and unemployment is worse, and business can't react as fast because in a lot of these European countries, you hire somebody, you've got them hired for life. You can't let them go. The laws protect a worker the minute he becomes an employee, and there you go. How does business react? Yes, it is displacing workers and so forth, but I teach I'm getting off the topic a minute here, but I teach a course in finance, and there's a couple of basic principles in economics and finance that are indisputable, and they've been indisputable since the beginning of time. And the one that's the most indisputable is capital has no conscience. Meaning money. Money has no conscience. It's going to go where it gets the highest return. That's just the way it is. It's it's as certain as death and taxes. And so what can happen is these European countries get more socialistic, and so businesses in those countries can't make as much money as they wanted to because of the government over-regulating, and the result is they take their money elsewhere. Money can travel, and in today's world, you can press a button and move $3 billion in a blink of an eye. So money is liquid, and it is movable. I mean, it can move quickly. and it's going to go where it gets the highest return. And that's just the way it is. And that's why all of a sudden you have 300 banks in the Cayman Islands for wealthy individuals and for certain companies. And the reason is the government's taken too much of their money. It's simply taxing them and not showing any restraint in its spending. And these companies have money, and what are they going to do? They're going to protect their money. They're going to get the best return for their money where they can get it. And that includes avoiding taxes. So they're just going to move the money somewhere else. And if our politicians could figure that out, we might be in a little better situation than we are now. But enough evangelizing, and I'll get down off my soapbox on that one. But anyway, but you can see how this plays into antitrust law and so forth. What we're trying to do is support the capitalistic free market system, because most people believe that that will give us the highest quality of life. There's an old saying that the problem with socialism is you eventually run out of other people's money, because that's what socialism's about. It's about taking, as Winston Churchill said, it's the equal sharing of misery. And socialism doesn't work, hasn't worked, and who knows if it will ever work. But the point is, capitalism has had to change, like the Rockefellers and those kinds of things, and we all acknowledge that that stuff's got to be reined in using antitrust laws and preventing monopolies and whatnot. Because to me, it's human nature also that if I get into a position of enormous power, I'm going to use that power. It's another simple fact of life in my mind. Humans get power in whatever position or state, and they want to keep that power. They want to protect that power. So companies that become powerful will want to crush the competition, and that's why antitrust comes along. And you can see it's to protect innovation. If someone can crush me, why am I going to spend my money and take a risk that I might come up with an innovative product I can sell and beat the competition? So that's a reason why the antitrust laws and government regulations, to a limited extent, can keep our free market system going, because people are willing to take the risk of new products and so forth and being innovative. Otherwise, there are not going to be new products, or not much chance of them. Anyway, off the topic and cost us another couple of minutes here. Okay, so again, back to the foreign countries, and again, the point is their antitrust laws, they're just trying to protect their economies and trying to protect the trade that they do with other countries. So they will slap the hands of France will slap the hands of Germany or Spain or the United States or England if we're doing something that they think is anti-competitive to one of their industries. Okay, monopolies. This is a focus on the single behavior of a company. And the one that they point out is predatory pricing. And predatory pricing is when a firm attempts to drive its competition out of the marketplace by selling at prices substantially below, and this is important, not substantially below what others are selling it for, but below the cost of producing it. I mean, that to me is about as clear as a bell what they're up to in predatory pricing. They've gotten strong enough that now they can go in, lower the price below the cost. Okay. Now, two examples, and I wish I could find this case. I'd send it to you. It's one of my cases have used in the last, not recently, but years back. But the first one involves Microsoft, and it involves. I could have sworn I missed a paragraph here, but let's see if I did. Maybe it's further back. Yeah, it is further back in my notes, which, by the way, I'm on page 5, and the notes only go to half of page 6, so we're getting there. But anyway, here's two examples, and you can see I get a little passionate about it. One is Microsoft, and I think it's the Netscape case. And in that case, what happened was Microsoft, as you know, had the operating system that was used by 99% of users in the world. They had all the applications that went with it on top of the operating platform, and no one else's applications could be used. So they were it. They were the dominant. They had market power, and they really had a monopolistic power. And what did they do? Along came this company, I believe it was called Netscape. A fellow named Mark Andreessen was, I think, was one of the founders, and a guy named Scott McNeely, I think. I may have the names wrong, but anyway, they formed a company. They came up with a web browser, and I think it was called Navigator. And this web browser was before Google and browsing the web and so forth. I forget how people did it. I'm not a tech person, but they apparently it was more cumbersome and not as efficient. They came up with this Navigator, and it was based. I think they said it was based on a Java. That's right. It was based on a Java system. Again, I don't know a whole lot about it, except that, as I understand it, Java is another operating system. I don't think it's the one that's open source in terms of people can contribute to it. I've forgotten the name of that one, but Java had its own operating system that was very well done, very effective, and it was getting some market share. And along came this browser using Java. Well, Microsoft saw the threat, so they went out and did their R&D, and they came up with Internet Explorer, which, as you know, is on just about every computer you see now. There's a reason for that, by the way, which I'll tell you about in a second. But in any event, they came up with Internet Explorer. Now, talk about predatory pricing. They gave it away. Forget about selling it below cost. They gave it away. They put it with their operating system. So they put it with Windows, and you got Internet Explorer with it. Now, how do you as Netscape compete with a company that's has a monopoly in the key software that runs 99% of the software in the world? How do you compete with them when they've got that position, they've got market power, and they're giving it to you? They're giving it for free. Not possible. Just not possible. Interesting how these little things happen, though. The reason for the Microsoft antitrust lawsuit was because Scott McNeely, if I believe he's the right guy, was from Utah. And he was a buddy of Orrin Hatch, the senator from Utah. And he went to Orrin Hatch and said, these guys at Microsoft are engaged in antitrust behavior, and something needs to be done. And when one of the agencies of the federal government, being the Department of Justice or Federal Trade, gets a call from a senator, they start looking up and listening up. And the reason being is these senators control their budgets. Everything is money, folks. Sadly, not everything, but a lot, particularly in business, which is what business is about, right? But in any event, Orrin Hatch calls up the Department of Justice and says, I want you to go look at these Microsoft guys because this is what they're doing. And it was clearly anti-competitive. There's no question about it. And Microsoft lost the case, or they settled it, I believe. I don't think they lost it, but they settled it. And now what they agreed to do was put Netscape and Internet Explorer in their packages. So they had originally gone to hardware manufacturers, the computer manufacturers, and said, either you put Internet Explorer in with our operating system when you build your systems, or we've encoded it so that if people try to run some other system, run Netscape, for example, or Navigator, it cripples the whole system, and the operating system doesn't work at all. Now, you tell me that probably fits about 5 of these concepts I've talked about today. In any event, Microsoft lost the suit, but it had already crushed Netscape by that time because big deal. So everybody knew about Internet Explorer, nobody knew a whole lot about Netscape, and I think Netscape eventually abandoned its efforts to gather large market share, and the whole thing was over. So anyway, that's one. Now the worst of all, and again, what am I doing time-wise here? Okay, just about at the hour now. And I'm getting on to page 6. The worst one, and it was in one of the law books in an abbreviated form, so you may or may not want to bother looking it up. But it's called American Stores versus Walmart. And if memory serves me, it was in the late 1900s. But here's what Walmart was doing. And I guess I take text on various things, take a text or get on my soapbox, but I will tell you something about Walmart. And it's the balance or the struggle in business with respect to, and I don't even want to say it's ethical, but it's the respect of what's best for the consumer, and then also what are the unintended consequences. And here's the unintended consequences of Walmart, which have an enormous impact on the United States today as you and I know it. And that is Walmart offered a broad range of products. So you could get hardware stuff there, you could get paint, you can buy just about anything that you could buy at any other store in small towns, but single stores. You went to the hardware store for this, you went to the linen store for that, you went to the little clothing store for this, you went to so-and-so for groceries. All these little mom and pop businesses that sold these things, Walmart put them all together. And then with the ability to buy in volume, then they began to dictate prices to the suppliers, to the vendors. And they are a tough bunch. Let me tell you, I have a friend from my business school, classmate from business school who dealt with them, and they are tough. They are merciless. They're ruthless. Now they try to give you this public image of, they're just the everyday American's best store. Well, granted, you get good pricing and you get, which is what we all want, right? We want the best goods for the cheapest amount of money. But here's what happened. Walmart would go not into the big store, not into the big metropolitan areas. They'd go into the small areas, the small towns and whatnot, and they'd open up a Walmart. And they would literally drive all the little mom and pop stores out of business because they couldn't compete price-wise. They couldn't buy in enough volume. They couldn't stock enough inventory because of the cash flow requirements. Walmart could do all that. The result of that is that small town America went away over the course of about 20, 25, 30 years. Went away. The reason you don't have little communities with stores and whatnot anymore is because you have the malls. And the malls all came about partially because of stores like Walmart and others that rolled all this stuff up together. I mean, you used to just go buy televisions at a little television store. And now you can go buy electronics all in one place. Well, that pretty much killed small town America because they put Walmarts, out of town of 3 miles, and everybody went out there. With that background, let me tell you about American Stores versus Walmart. American Stores versus Walmart were a chain of drugstores, and they offered a lot of things like drugstores do today. Not CVS and them offer a lot more than when this case took place, but they've also gotten into food. Everybody has to try to compete, but drugstores were a little more narrow in their products. Here's what Walmart would do. Walmart would send buyers into the American Drug stores where they were, and American Drugs, I think, was headquartered down south somewhere. And in any event, they would go and they'd look on the shelves and they'd say, well, okay, well, here's toothpaste, 2 tubes of toothpaste for maybe they sold for $2 and for $3. So they're selling 2 tubes of toothpaste for $3 that would normally sell for $4 for 2. Walmart would go in, look at those, and come out the following day or 3 or 4 days later with their sales, and they'd sell the two tubes of toothpaste for $2.50. So now Walmart could handle, or they might say $2, okay? Well, American stores couldn't do that because then there's no profit for them. And Walmart's attitude was, we can buy the toothpaste for, maybe they can buy it for $2. Or they can buy it for $2.10. They didn't care. They lose the 10 cents for a couple reasons. One, people would come to their store to get what's known as a loss leader to buy the toothpaste, which is a great deal for them to save a couple bucks. But Walmart had so many other goods and so merchandise in there that they'd make it back up on people buying at the regular price for the other stuff. So, is that predatory pricing? According to Clay McQuitty, it is. According to the Supreme Court of Arkansas, it was not. Now, note, however, that the case was, they talk about being hometown. The case was filed in Arkansas, the state of Arkansas, Where do you think Walmart's headquarters are? Bentonville, Arkansas. The case was heard in Arkansas. Bentonville is where Walmart is. They're the largest employer in the state, probably the most powerful contributor of anything in the state. And American stores lost that case on appeal to the Utah Supreme Court on the basis that it was not anti-competitive behavior, that it was not predatory pricing, that consumers are entitled to the best deal they can get anywhere. And I think that's a bunch of baloney. To me, it was clear. It's one thing if they offered a lower price, but they were actually going in, and in other words, they might go in and see what they're putting on sale, and then they put their stuff on sale. But here they were going in and going to the specific products that American stores might have on a really good sale basis. And they turn around and offer below cost pricing for those exact same prices. I don't think, I think some of these Supreme Court justices lose touch with the world, just like our congressmen do. These ivory tower academics. I mean, give me a break. You don't need a law degree to know that that's predatory pricing. And that's the case, American stores versus Walmart. And you can tell there's a lot more than the law involved in the outcome of this case. And I read it 10 years ago, and it still gets me fired up every time I talk about it. So anyway, as far as I'm concerned, I'll never give you a question on this, but if I ever gave you a question about that case and asked you if that was predatory pricing, you darn well better come back with the answer yes, because it's outrageous to me the way the outcome was. Anyway, okay, let's wrap it up here. Okay, now with respect to, they talk about monopolization, and that deals with a company that has monopoly power and shows an intent to maintain it. So that's your definition of monopolization by the U.S. Supreme Court. It's a company, two things. It has monopoly power, means it's the dominant company in that industry, or the only company, and that it shows an intent to maintain that power by means that are anti-competitive. Okay, so you can have a monopoly power, and if your company has attained that monopoly power and kept it by the use of good business judgment and efficient operations, then the court's going to look at that and say we're not going to find that a monopolization that's in violation of the antitrust laws. But if you engage in conduct that is anti-competitive, then that equals or demonstrates the intent. And in my mind, that was the Microsoft Netscape case. Microsoft had a monopoly. They were dominant power. They had an ability to drive Netscape out of business, or to kill the threat, and literally kill it. And that's basically what they did. And to me, that shows the intent that you need to show monopolization. And once you show monopolization, and then you see anti-competitive behavior, then there you go. You go to the Clayton Act, and you fine them, whatever, for that activity. Note also that monopoly involves two things. It's the power to affect prices and output. Okay, so in the case of Microsoft, they had the ability to affect prices. Not so much output in this case, but prices. The output part of monopoly is where you don't put out enough product to meet the demand, you can drive the prices up that way. And so depending on how companies handle that, they have to be very careful how they handle that. You're going to die when I tell you we're almost finished, because it's going to be about an hour and 10 minutes. But in any event, there's a section there called unilateral refusal to deal. It's it's not anything that I would be terribly concerned about. The case example they give is in Aspen, Colorado. There were 4 ski resorts. The Aspen Resort Company, I think, owned 3 of them, and there was an independent ski resort there. Initially, they had started a thing where I think it was called All-Day Aspen Ski Package, and you could pay one price and ski at all 4 locations. And then the Aspen Company decided they weren't going to participate anymore, and so in effect they refused to deal with the independent a ski company, and they got their hand slapped for that. And that's this example of unilateral refusal of a deal. Again, I don't think it's a major point to be made. So anyway, that's everything that I want to run over for you today. Keep in mind these things. One, for business, it needs competition. It's good for the economy, not just the consumers, but for the economy. But it needs to have anti-competitive conduct monitored, regulated, prevented, or corrected. And the reason is, if it's not, then new people trying to come in won't take the risk. And also, it kills innovation, because you know that you're going to get crushed if you come up with a product you think's better. You know what market power is. Just remember, patents are legalized monopolies for a short period of time, 20-year period of time. And then the goal of the antitrust laws are, it's not bad if you have market power, but the question is, how's the company gone about getting it? And secondly, how are they conducting themselves once they had it? So the Microsoft case is number two, how they conducted themselves once they had it. And then the other one the number one example of how companies go about getting market power, that's probably the Walmart case. And then just remember that you do need to know the Sherman Antitrust Act, you do need to know the Clayton Act. Although I think I didn't say I was going to quiz those today. So in any event, it would be wise to know them. And then enforcement and exemptions, and then the origins of federal regulation. I have my notes out of order here a little, it looks like. And then finally the global aspect of antitrust law, which is to try to, again, balance competition in the world, not just in the United States. So that's everything. I'm going to have knocked this out in about an hour and 12 minutes. I'm going to be out of town next week, actually starting the end of this week. So I'll be working from an off-site to do week 8, starting next week. You can certainly reach me by email. I'll be checking my email. I have my computer here with me, and we'll probably be delivering the lecture. In fact, I will, from back east. And then I'll be back in town on Friday, March 1st. So anyway, good luck with the research paper. I know you're probably under a little pressure now because you waited a while, but I understand that. But try to make it a good one. I do look at them closely. I really want to see some good workmanship here. I definitely want to see good proofreading and good writing and good format and so forth. And I'm looking really forward to seeing them, because every semester I get these, I really enjoy them, because most of my students do a really nice job with them and put down some very thoughtful things about them. And I understand from feedback I get from them that you actually learned something from your project. So I hope you picked one you liked, and it's going to stimulate you a little bit. And wish you best of luck with it. You will be able to reach me by email. I think you have my phone number. If you don't, it's 714-493-5300. And so if any emergency does arise, you may call me. If I don't answer, I will call you back. I hope you all will have a good week at work. Again, I'm looking forward to looking at the research papers. And with that being said, we're actually going to close out here reasonably early for me. So appreciate you listening, and just try to ignore the soapbox sermons, and good luck with your work. And I will talk to you next week. Goodbye.